Well, good afternoon. My name is Eduardo Gamarra. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University, where I also serve as the Associate Director for Basic Research in the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, which is the institute sponsoring this particular live stream. I'm delighted to welcome some very distinguished speakers, some of whom I've known for many years, and others whom I've just begun to know their work very recently. I'm going to start by just very briefly introducing you. I'm going to start with Chris Sabatini, who is currently a senior fellow for Latin America at the Chatham House. And of course, he's been a professor of international and public affairs for many years. Uh, I know him going back to his days at the Inter-American Foundation. I don't want to say exactly what year that was, Chris, but I'm sure you remember.
Please don't. Please don't.
I'm also pleased to introduce Jeff Ramsey, who is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Adian Arsht Latin America Center. And of course, we know Jeff's work on Venezuela, on the Andes, and on Latin America in general. And of course, he goes back to some very good work with Insight Crime and other organizations, including the Open Society Foundation. Jeff is joining us from Bogota, Colombia. I'm delighted to welcome Gabriela Rachadel de Delgado, somebody new for us, but somebody we're looking forward to having as a regular member of our panels. She is the co-managing partner and member of the executive committee and leader of the energy department at Interjuris Abogados, based in Caracas, Venezuela. Her work is mainly in the negotiation and incorporation of oil joint ventures. She advises foreign oil companies and that do business in Venezuela. So we're looking forward very much to this view from inside Venezuela at this critical moment. Of course, Professor Monaldi, whom we've had as a good friend of ours for many times now, is the fellow in Latin American energy policy and director of the Latin America Energy Program at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And then I want to finally introduce David Goldwyn, who's been with us before as well. David is the president of Goldwyn Global Strategies. He's an international which is an international energy advisory consultancy, and he's been the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center Energy Advisory Group. So we have a very interesting panel, and I want to begin, therefore, our conversation this afternoon basically by looking at a series of questions related to the the current situation with U.S. Latin American relations, and in particular U.S. Venezuela relations. So I want to begin by basically asking a very broad question, and I will start with Gabriela, asking her to kind of situate us. Um, and to situate us in the current context, Gabriela, the current U.S. approach to Venezuela includes this $50 million bounty on Nicolás Maduro, while at the same time allowing Chevron to resume operations. And there's also with naval deployments. And of course, this is a context where Maduro has mobilized, he says, about 4.5 militia members. How should we understand this dual track strategy? What does it reveal, frankly, about where we are and frankly, about foreign policy in general?
Mhm. Hi, how are you? Thank you for inviting me. I would like first to talk about a little bit about the economic sanctions in general and to put you in context of different things or different type of sanctions that apply in Venezuela. We have primary sanctions and secondary sanctions. Remember, I am a lawyer, so I want to put everybody in context. On the primary sanctions, we have to have the involvement of a U.S. person, a prohibited transaction or dealing, a block entity, which is the government of Venezuela, and it has to be without any applicable exception or a license from the OFAC, okay? So if you are a U.S. person, then you are in the situation that you may have primary sanctions. But there is also secondary sanctions. So non-U.S. persons may also be exposed to sanctions even in the absence of U.S. nexus, and the risk is not automatic. It's totally on the discretion of the U.S. administration. So the thing is, this approach, in my view, responds to the importance of having a difference between the economic situation of the country and the companies doing business in Venezuela and the sanctity of contracts. That is a concept that I would like to discuss today, while you have a political discussion on the table. So there are many things that the US is doing. There are diplomatic tools that they are using to force certain political outcome. But the economic sanctions, in my view, should not be used only to force political things, but to have a second layer of supervision that is good for everybody, is good for the major companies involved, and it's good to have a clear vision of what is going on, brings transparency, and do not, if you have the sanctions plus licensing system that works, then you have the best of both worlds for the US point of view. In my view, as a Venezuelan, because I live in Venezuela and I have seen all the different impact of the sanctions in the Venezuelan population, in my personal view, I prefer that we don't have any sanctions. But if that is not possible, and it's not the US policy to do it, then at least have a manageable a system of licenses that create a climate of supervision that supports sustainable development with credible oversight, minimizing corruption, and supporting qualified business plans. So if you take into account that, the dual approach is understandable, because you have to take into account that we in Venezuela are suffering a lot. So you cannot do a total sanction system without any licenses. And you have to create an environment in which companies feel comfortable investing in Venezuela. If companies have to leave the country because it's untenable doing business here, they will take a long time in coming back. No political resolution will be sustainable if qualified companies are forced to leave because operating here becomes impossible. That is not the outcome that we want. We want to welcome investment for a long time, regardless of the political situation, and it should not be used, the political situation should not be used, or the sanctions should not be used to change the political outcome. I think that is a mistake that we have been committing for a long time with no tangible results, not in here and in any other country in the world.
Okay. Thank you, Gabriela. Let me go now to Francisco Monaldi for sort of this introductory statement, responding to this overall setting that I said at the beginning. Francisco?
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm happy to join this panel of good friends. I think my first intervention will be a little bit about also of context of what's happening in the energy sector and how the policy in the Trump administration has been shifting. As you'll know, Trump came in at the beginning, didn't touch any of the licenses that Biden had approved. The main ones were three production licenses: Chevron, Repsol, and Morel and Prom. And then there were other licenses for exporting natural gas to Trinidad, producing and exporting. And then there were others to buy Venezuelan oil, like the one that Harry Sargent had or Reliance had. So all of those were canceled it started with the announcement that the Chevron one was going to be canceled, and then Chevron was not allowed to pay the Venezuelan government. So basically, they were not allowed to take any cargoes on the Venezuelan side. And it seemed that was it for a while, right? That would be the policy of the Trump administration was no licenses. But then a few weeks back, we had this new announcement of Chevron receiving a new license, which is not the same as the previous license. And that has some interesting, I think, implications. The first thing is that Chevron now cannot. It used to be that Chevron took the revenues from their exports to the U.S. They exchange them into bolivars. They pay the income tax and royalties to the money equivalent to the mixed enterprise or JV, and the JV paid in bolivars the taxes and royalties to the government. And then they also exchange in order to get bolivars to pay some of the OPEX and CAPEX, and about 20% they used to get their debt repaid. So, and Chevron did invest and significantly increase production. Most of the increase in production in the previous 2 years was of Chevron. But now Chevron basically pays the government by giving them a share of production, which we don't know exactly the details, but I suspect it will be between 30 and 50%, but could be more. And Chevron takes the rest to the US. So we will see a reduction in the oil coming to the US because now the Venezuelan government has to take their part of the oil and sell it in the black market. And so this is a big change in that the Venezuelan private sector, who was enjoying the dollars coming from those exports that were exchanged into bolivars in Venezuela, are not going to receive most of those dollars are not coming back, just a fraction perhaps for OPEX and CAPEX. So that's a big change. The other big change is that now for Maduro, he has to sell the barrels in the black market, which of course generates potential for significant discounts and difficulties in getting the money back. And in fact, of course, the US could impose more pressure if they do things in the regarding those exports to China in different ways to obstaculize them. That will mean even less revenue for Maduro. So it is positive for refiners in Texas and Louisiana because they are getting back some of the oil that came from Venezuela before, and they were looking for heavy oil, but it will have less impact than in the past. It seems that it's less attractive for the government of Maduro and is significantly less attractive for the Venezuelan private sector. And lastly, I wanted to mention that the day when this was announced, there was the perception that this was part of a flexibilization, again, of sanctions, that we will see other licenses approved, including the ones to the Europeans, perhaps the gas licenses. But of course, and I know we will discuss a lot about this in the rest of the conversation, the announcement came combined with the tremendous escalation in terms of rhetoric, the declaration of the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization, the Navy ships going close to Venezuelan waters, even something that I didn't expect, the government of Trinidad sort of aligning clearly with the US, which makes it really hard for deals with Trinidad to happen anytime soon. So this combination of license to Chevron doesn't seem that others are going to get licenses anytime soon, or at least the Europeans, and this sort of massive escalation in other areas are a mix that to me, I have to say, was pretty surprising, and it's not clear to me what the objectives are, what the U.S. government aims to do in Venezuela. Why are they sending these Navy ships? If it's just, as stated, a drug-related operation, or there are other possible explanations for that in terms of signaling, in terms of generating costs for the black market exports. If it's a signal to Mexico regarding drug interdiction or whatever. So it is a very fluid and, to me, difficult to understand set of policies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me go to David Goldwyn. Same setup.
Thanks, Eduardo, and great to be here with such excellent colleagues and friends. I think what we're seeing here is, for me, is not quite confusing. What we are seeing is really a consolidation of foreign policy and defense power by Secretary Rubio. I think he's not only the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Now, for all practical purposes, he's kind of acting like Secretary of Defense as well. The U.S. is now embarked on a regime change strategy, at least for the time being, using it both economic coercion and military intimidation. I think while they have multiple interests, the U.S. has multiple interests, migration, containing migration, and oil price stability, there's also domestic politics. And so I think what we're seeing here is that, at least for now, the U.S. government has been quite clear, I think, both by tweets from Secretary Rubio and from others, that they are declaring Maduro illegitimate, and they are hoping that a combination of economic coercion and putting a bounty on his head and having this Marine amphibious group and the destroyers come down there will create enough dissent inside the regime, or fear inside the regime, that he is pushed out. They've also, by declaring him the head of now 2 different terrorist organizations, created a legal pretext under which they can interdict ships, or they can take actions based on terrorism grounds, since they really don't have a self-defense claim under international law. So they've created the legal pretext. And so this is maximum pressure plus. It's maximum pressure part 2. And so far, there's absolutely no indication that any of this is working to achieve its intended goals. I think what we've seen since the change in sanctions is that Venezuelan production and exports have increased since the licenses were revoked, even if marginally. Production is about 1.1 million barrels a day. As predicted, most of the oil is now not going to the United States, except for Chevron's share, but going to China, through the Dark Fleet and other ships. Even refining seems to be up. And the Russians are back supplying the naphtha that Venezuela needs in order to refine its crude oil. So, in terms of objectives, we have pushed them back into the hands of the Chinese and the Russians. We haven't impacted production at all. Inflation is probably, right now on record to be maybe 140% this year. So you're creating economic pressure inside the regime. Polls show that sanctions remain as unpopular with most Venezuelans now as they did then, and most people favor negotiations. So it's hard to see that the administration is going to achieve any of its goals. And I think as we get to Chris and and to others, there's no place in the world, Gabriela said this as well, where you externally create this kind of change in regime by threat and intimidation or by sanctions. It comes from indigenous, homegrown, sort of middle class fostering for change. And the path that we were on before, which was privatizing the economy so that citizens are not so dependent on the government for everything, for fuel, for food, for everything else, is a way to reduce the power of the government. But we're heading in the other direction. It's not so clear how long this policy is going to last. I think my own sense is that Rubio has been given his head to try this policy and to see whether it works. I think the probability is pretty low. We have some important votes coming up in the U.S. Congress in September, on debt limits and on budgets. So we have to worry about, the Republicans have to worry about their very thin majorities. So there's a domestic political angle to all of this. But at some point, if the economy tanks again, migration pressure increases, the neighbors in Venezuela's neighbors are under increasing pressure. And we have something go boom elsewhere in the global oil markets, where we have a little bit more of a squeeze on heavy crudes, then this policy may change. But for now, I think we're watching a rerun with the additional intimidation. But I think it's going to have the same ending as the one we saw before.
Great. Thank you, David. Let's go to Bogota now with Jeff Ramsey.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks so much for having me, and great to speak with you all. So I agree with much of what's been said, with some caveats. I don't think that we're witnessing max pressure plus. I think you can more fairly characterize the policy as max pressure light. I think really what we're seeing is the U.S. having already recognized an additional set of interests in Venezuela beyond democracy and human rights, which explains why the U.S. made the decision to grant Chevron the license. And I also think it explains why we see ongoing cooperation between the U.S. and the Maduro regime on deportations. There were 9 deportation flights to Venezuela last month. The majority of those flights were ICE air flights, meaning they were paid for by the U.S. government. They went from ICE detention facilities in Texas and Florida and elsewhere directly to Maiquetía Airport. That wouldn't happen if there weren't some form of back channel between Washington and Caracas. And I think there's other things that sort of lead us to be a little bit more skeptical of the narrative of max pressure here. The other is the designation of the Cartel de los Soles. Back in February, the Trump administration designated 8 cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, including Tren de Aragua, Cartel de Sinaloa, Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación. Notably, last month's designation of the Cartel de los Soles was not a foreign terrorist organization designation. This didn't come from DOJ. This was a Treasury designation. This was a Treasury designation that created a sanctions framework for individuals affiliated with the Cartel de los Soles to be designated or to be added to the individual sanctions list that Treasury maintains. The issue with that, as all of you know, is that everybody high level who is alleged to be a part of the Cartel de los Soles is either already sanctioned or under indictment. So, I sort of see a gap between rhetoric and reality in U.S. policy here. And I think, frankly, the troop mobilizations that we're seeing, or the naval asset mobilizations that we're seeing in the South Caribbean, are not anything new. I mean, we saw 3 separate freedom of navigation operations from the U.S. Navy in 2020. And, then, just as now, we didn't see the U.S. invade Venezuela. We didn't see targeted strikes. We didn't see preemptive strikes on Venezuela, or anything resembling a regime change operation. I think ultimately what this recent mobilization is it's a show of strength. I think it's an attempt to dissuade the regime from arresting Maria Corina Machado, and I think it's ultimately a way of signaling to high-level military elites in Venezuela that if they decide to engage in a military uprising, a coup d'etat against Maduro, they might receive some kind of secondary support from the naval assets stationed in the Caribbean. But Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau was very clear 2 weeks ago when he said that the U.S. is not interested in regime change operations. The U.S. is not, according to Deputy Secretary Landau, in the business of toppling governments. Instead, he was very careful in saying that the U.S. can work with democratic forces in countries where the U.S. is trying to advance return to democracy. But the idea that the U.S. will lead the charge in a military intervention in Venezuela, I think, is safely off the table. I also just want to highlight here that I think, I disagree somewhat with David in that I don't think that this policy is unsustainable. I think this is actually a pretty sustainable equilibrium here. From my view, it's a relatively cynical win-win. I think the U.S. receives deportation cooperation from Venezuela. They receive oil from Venezuela via the Chevron license. The regime receives de facto legitimacy from ongoing negotiations and evidence of a back channel between Washington and Caracas. And some parts of the opposition receive hardline rhetoric and the hope of some kind of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela that will never materialize. And I think that's what's really sad about all of this is that you have Venezuelans that are desperate for change, that saw an election last year that the government stole in the most blatant and grotesque manner. And now we're back to where we were in 2019 and 2020, where the opposition is getting signals from abroad that the U.S. will provide some kind of a magical solution and hand the country over to them on a silver platter. And I think the challenge with that is that the wrong people believe that rhetoric. Maduro has called the U.S. bluff. The regime understands that any kind of military action is unlikely, but the opposition base does not. And I think this fuels a lot of magical thinking, and I think it does a great disservice to the opposition still in Venezuela that's trying to organize and stay engaged and mobilize against very adverse conditions on the ground.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's an interesting juxtaposition with David, and I'm sure we'll get back to that in just a moment. Let me turn now to Chris in London, Chris Sabatini. Same introductory statements in this new scenario that we're living.
So thanks. I want to thank Eduardo and FIU for hosting us. It's a great panel. So thank you. I'm going to echo what's already been said. This is the problem of coming last, but I'm going to be a little more provocative. So first, I think we've reached the moment of peak performance. By that, I don't mean athletic performance. Eduardo, you were a track runner. I'm a runner too. This is peak performance on the part, in particular, of the Trump administration. People talk about the lack of a policy of the Trump administration. This is a policy, as actually Jeff just said, it's very calculated. It's not to say it's going to work, but on the one hand, yielding some concessions to Chevron to take the pressure off the administration's back from Chevron and other lobbyists, some of whom actually Francisco mentioned, but then also giving basically Rubio the bullhorn to do what he does best, which is basically virtue signal, rattle the cage, and try to pretend that something sticks. And so moving away from Francisco, and Francisco knows the details of the oil contract far better than I do. But in this case, let's just look at what Rubio is trying to do, which is effectively an extension. And I get Jeff's point. It's not maximum pressure ramped up, but it is at least the extension of Trump 1. We should all remember, I don't know if we do, the time that John Bolton, which is probably not in favor right now in the White House, walked into a press conference with a notebook under his hand that said 4,500 troops, Afghanistan, Colombia, ? It was all an attempt to try to rattle the inner circle of Maduro, to try to basically engage in, I'm sorry, but amateur psyops, to say to the military around Maduro, hey, if you don't defect now, we're going to be coming for you. It didn't work then. Don't think it's going to work now, for the very reason that whether it's the bounty on Maduro's head being ramped up from 25 million to 50 million, which is, I'll be quite honest, is ridiculous. Does anyone actually think that there's someone in Maduro's inner circle who's going to say, you know what, I'm not going to take the guy out for 25, what 50 million? Yeah, now we're talking. Of course they're not going to. This is all performance. And the same thing with the naval ships and the troops soon to be off the coast of Venezuela. Maybe 4,500 troops off the coast of Venezuela. Some of the Marines. No one believes in their right mind that this will lead to an invasion of Venezuela. It's taking 2,200 National Guard troops in Jeff's hometown of Washington, D.C. to secure the insecure streets of Washington, D.C. I'm joking, of course. Washington, D.C. is very secure. But you wouldn't send 4,500 U.S. troops to invade a country. And the fallacy that somehow this could spark some sort of uprising. And here, again, I'm going to echo Jeff, that the opposition is sort of falling into this ploy, again, is somewhat sad. This is simply Juan Guaido ramped up with it, the effect that I think it will actually lessen the capacity of the democratic opposition in Venezuela to be able to rally. Now, to the question of whether sanctions work, we at Chatham House recently did research on sanctions. And, you know, it's funny, you talk to the Venezuelan opposition and their sanction strategy is it's going to be necessary to bring the regime to the table. The truth is, regardless of the debates between a number of very prominent scholars who talk about whether sanctions cause basically unexpected consequences on populations and starvation and hunger and general poverty, the truth is sanctions, when you look at them over the course of sanctions history from 1950 to 2023, sanctions that are dedicated to the issue of promoting democracy, defending human rights, and promoting regime change have at best a very spotty track record. So we looked at 858 sanctions that had been imposed from 1950 to 2023, all of them dedicated entirely to the issue of democracy, human rights, and regime change. Of those, 436 were labeled, and these were imposed by the US, the UK, UN, other places. All of those 436 demonstrated or were declared to be a success. Just hold that for a second. 113 of those had been declared to fail, but 309 of them are ongoing, including the sanctions, the old timer in the group, the 1962 sanctions on Cuba. But even when you look at those so-called success stories, those are success stories in semi-democracies, US allies, or countries that were already undergoing a transition. So where sanctions dedicated to democracy, human rights, and regime change worked were in Fiji, US ally, Poland, already undergoing a transition, Cambodia, Burundi, and Chile after the no vote. Where sanctions didn't work were China, Belarus, Myanmar, Cuba, and Equatorial Guinea. This reinforces what Tufts professor Daniel Dresner calls the sanctions paradox. Sanctions are often leveled against enemies of a particular country or enemies of the international order, but they tend to work better with allies. And why is that? I mean, it's not difficult to imagine, and Gabriela mentioned this. First of all, if you don't have a private sector, independent private sector, there's no democracy. We know this, even going back to John Locke, to cite a hoary philosopher from my now adopted country. The second is that what we see is that when sanctions are imposed, regimes in power, the target regime tends to collect those assets and redistribute them to cronies. The classic example of this is Vladimir Putin. After 2022, when the US demanded sanctions and McDonald's had to pull out, what did Vladimir Putin do? He basically nationalized McDonald's and he redistributed it to an ally who renamed the now Russian McDonald's Tasty and nothing else. I say that because it's actually kind of funny, like sort of the in-your-face Russian way of like tasty and nothing else. So screw you, go to Siberia if you don't think this is really tasty. Similarly, we see this in Venezuela, Iran, North Korea. Basically, sanctions allow regimes to be able to consolidate power. The second is this is not even the 1960s or the 1970s. There is a growing axis of the sanctions. We see this with Russia's collaboration with China, with North Korea, and with Iran. The idea that sanctions will isolate a country and an economy to wreak havoc on it is no longer true. In fact, quite the opposite. Countries are now developing parallel means, whether through cryptocurrency, SWIFT-like mechanisms, or even sort of shadow fleets to be able to evade sanctions. But the last thing is the fundamental idea of sanctions working, whether it's to provoke defection or provoke a popular uprising, has been proven consistently fundamentally flawed, especially in Cuba, but also we're seeing it now in Venezuela. It simply doesn't work. Eduardo, when you mentioned I used to teach at Columbia University in policy, I used to always tell my students, every policy should have a theory of change. And if it doesn't work, and it should be clear. And if that theory of change doesn't work, it's time to readjust. The truth is that theory of change, of sanctions provoking an uprising, simply hasn't worked. But the problem is we're dealing with an intermestic issue now in the United States, in which there's a committed group of politicians and a hyper-mobilized constituency that's dedicated to sanctions regardless of whether they work. And it's time to revisit that. I think negotiations of the sort that Jeff mentioned is very much on the table, but also what Gabriela mentioned, the fact that sanctions can actually wither the independent economic activities of a country should lead us to wonder whether this is going to work, but it doesn't matter. In the meantime, we're signaling now to the military, hoping that they'll somehow defect. It may work at some point. I highly doubt it.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I want to go now a little bit further into the weeds, and I want to start again with Gabriela. I want to ask you some maybe some specific questions related to how Venezuela is seeing this. And so, what I'd like to ask you, from your perspective as a lawyer in Caracas, how do these shifting U.S. sanctions, as all of you have discussed, sometimes tightened, sometimes relaxed, how does that affect, for example, the principle of sanctity of contracts? What kind of legal uncertainty do companies face, and what happens to investors when these rules keep changing? And really, what does this mean for the future in this particular context?
Yeah, it has been very, very difficult for investors to see that the concept of sanctity of contract is not weighted enough. In general, some leaders say, okay, let's change the regime that Chevron had. That Chevron has been for 100 years in Venezuela, and they invested even before President Chavez was in power. So not only Chevron, all the companies that are here, several of them major oil companies, have been affected by the sanctions, and but that this change in rhetoric and affects their own projects, and this is extremely bad for the future of Venezuela. And there is this concept probably that if there is a regime change, then all the oil companies are going to come to Venezuela, and it's not true. They are going to see how people have treated the companies that are already here. We did an analysis with the EA of Madrid. We have a meeting there with several oil companies from Europe and Asia and some American companies and companies that were interested in coming to Venezuela. And we have like a list of questions for all of them and private meetings with them. And they all make an emphasis on the sanctity of contracts and how the different actors in Venezuela are going to conduct themselves in connection with those contracts. Because when they come to Venezuela, they come for 20, 30 years, depending on the type of agreements. So they are not willing to accept that a change in politics will change their contracts. So they need to have that assurance. And we have to bear in mind that this is extremely important for the future of our country. We need foreign investors, and we need them to understand and to be certain that changes in politics will not change their contracts. Otherwise, they will never invest the huge amounts of money that they have to invest because they are hoping to receive a return on investment over the years.
Okay, so I want to drill down a little bit more with you, Gabriela. What is the difference between primary and secondary sanctions in Venezuela today?
Okay, primary sanctions are applicable to U.S. persons, basically, and there are 4 elements that have to be present in order for primary sanctions to apply. The most important one is a U.S. person. U.S. person is a national, a resident, a company organized under the laws of the United States, or a person that is physically in the United States. So that's primary sanctions. And then there are secondary sanctions for non-U.S. persons, mainly when they are helping the government of Venezuela in a materially way, or they are doing corruption or deceptive practices. The thing is, in the past, all the oil companies that were not Americans, they asked for something called a letter of comfort. And the comfort letters were given to several companies. The problem was mainly with the overcompliance from banks and the image problems that not having a license would cause to these type of companies. So they all went and asked for a license. So on May 27, 7 companies have licenses. Only one of them were American. And now the position of OFAC at this very moment, we were discussing this morning, one of the cases is that there has to be a component or content, US content, in order for the OFAC to give you a license. So we are now gathering the information for these companies that used to have a license. What are the changes required for them to request a license? Because comfort letter is not enough. Comfort letter was the thing that they gave when the secondary license was the only risk. But there is an image and an overcompliance risk that is inevitable, okay? So what we have to do now is to see what is the position of the US government regarding the new requirements that are needed in order for those companies that are not US companies to be able to request a license, because they all need it.
Okay, great. And so let me now sort of go back to
Eduardo, I'm sorry, can I just add one thing? I started to
sure, of
interrupt.
course. No,
But
that's it.
this is what Gabriel is saying is actually, there's a larger diplomatic point here, is that there's a risk now, we seem to see this in other patterns of this White House's economic statecraft, which is to favor American companies, which will make it much more difficult for the US to lead any sort of coalition to put pressure on Venezuela. If you're cutting Shell out, or Repsol, or Eni, or Marelli Prom, which are all have, as Francisco knows far better than I do, assets and investments or expectations on, it's going to be much more difficult to bring along the Europeans. So the US is isolating itself when it only favors the United States. So I just wanted to make that point because Gabriela was making, sorry.
That's fine.
No, it's a very important point because in general, sanctions harm the US companies more than anyone else and give a great opportunity to Russian and Chinese companies to take not only the production, which was what everybody's talking about, but all the services and all the different goods that were sold from American companies before are now being sold by Chinese, Russian companies or Indian companies. So that's, spaces that were before American spaces, and now they are being filled by other nationalities.
great. And finally, Gabriela, and I'm going to go back to the rest of the panel, but are there any viable legal pathways for doing business in Venezuela despite the sanctions?
Yes. First of all, you have to protect, when going to Venezuela, you have to protect yourself and use a country that gives you an investment protection treaty, which allows you to go to an arbitration outside the United States if there is certain conducts by the government. And you also need to protect yourself from the tax point of view. So all of our clients, we suggest that they come from a country that has this dual protection by treaties. At this moment, Spain is the country that provides better protection for investments. Of course, the fear for sanctions is very, very important for all our clients because we represent major companies. And since May 27, for the first time in 35 years, I see nothing, nobody is coming, which is very rare for me because usually I'm very lucky to have more than 45 clients, oil companies, and all of them are always looking and asking questions. At this very moment, I have been in 2 months vacation because nobody's asking anything. And of course, I have other businesses to do and other things in other countries, not related to law, but it's difficult.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. Let me now go broader and ask Jeff, and maybe David, you can also chime in, but because Chris, to a certain extent, has told us, right, that not only based on his study and certainly his reflections on what sanctions have done in the case of Cuba, for example, uh, but what does the Venezuelan cases we're currently seeing tell us or reveal about the limitations or the possibilities of sanction regimes? And what might be the key factors that determine whether we should continue to use these sanctions to push for democratic transitions? I think Chris made the case very strongly that the results are not very good in terms of democratic transitions. What is your view, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that I think we need to think about pressure in terms of hydraulics. Pressure, in order to actually be channeled, needs to feed into something. And I think it's an apt metaphor for sanctions pressure. I think one of the reasons why we saw the opposition really ride a series of successes, starting with the opposition primary in 2023 and the election last year, is because we saw the U.S. Use pressure in a concerted way to try to shape incentives inside the regime. The promise of sanctions relief via negotiations with the United States and with the opposition is the reason why the regime didn't interfere in the opposition primary. It's the reason why we saw the regime agree to competitive elections. And while obviously, the regime stole the election, the reality is that the fact that the opposition was able to organize and mobilize on the ground and demonstrate their overwhelming victory in that election, I think set up the opposition for their biggest success in years. And so, I think the important thing here is to avoid a set it and forget it approach. The idea that you just slap on sanctions and walk away and check back in 30 years and see if you've achieved regime change. I think, the case of Cuba shows pretty clearly that that hasn't worked well for the United States. I think what we've been thinking a lot about at the Atlantic Council, and we've been engaging with a lot of Venezuelan opposition stakeholders who've been involved in previous negotiations efforts, is how to work with the Trump administration to build off of these past successes and use tools that the Trump administration explored in the first go around. In 2020, the White House issued what was called the Democratic Transition Framework. And it was really interesting because it basically was a roadmap to power sharing combined with a menu of options for sanctions relief that paved the way forward for the democratic opening of Venezuela. It did not involve Maduro cutting off his own head and handing it to the opposition on a silver platter. It really grappled with complex questions around transitional justice and incorporated elements of power sharing. And I think all of those are going to be really important as we continue to think about how to ensure that that we actually channel the pressure into something. I think ultimately this is a game of incentives, and it's in the U.S. interest to keep Maduro on the ropes, to keep presenting not just Maduro but others in the inner circle with dilemmas that continue to make a democratic opening more attractive than the status quo.
Okay, thank you. David, would you like to add something to this?
Yes, no, I agree with a good deal of what's been said. I had the benefit of being at the State Department for almost a decade and seeing, sanctions. We did a lot of sanctions work, first on Bosnia and then on Iraq and then on Haiti, and Iran. And I think that the sort of the three big lessons that you learn first are that sanctions are effective when they're multilateral, not when they're unilateral. You have to have other countries doing it. Otherwise, it's very easy to evade them. And we have secondary sanctions. We're impacting other people's behavior. That is different than multilateral sanctions. And the second, I think, as Jeff explained well, is that when sanctions relief is tied to specific actions and measurable actions in essentially in a series or a timeline of events, then you can test the goodwill of each of the parties to fulfill the agreements, and you can make progress. We had the rapprochement with Vietnam. That was, probably a 2-year timeline, in years back. You had the JCPOA, where it was very specific what the relief was going to be, and it was going to be conditioned on inspections, on measurable actions. And then the Venezuela example, which I think was a good example of using sanctions to obtain specific relief. So you have to have them sort of used as an instrument. But the third lesson really is that it's an instrument that needs a strategy. So what exactly are we trying to achieve? And you can imagine a strategy which is release of political prisoners, more access to media, scheduling of regional elections, changing of the laws, a whole series of things where you could see if an action happens, provide some relief, see if another action has and provide some relief. But we don't have that. Right now, the strategy is, would you please leave? And it's based on narco-terrorism, so they're not calling it regime change. But the White House says we're willing to use boots on the ground to make sure no drugs come into the United States, when there's actually very little transshipment of narcotics from Venezuela, to the United States. It's clear what the attempt is. It's just kind of a simplistic strategy that, as Chris and others have detailed, very little sign of people just saying, "Oh, that's scary, I'm going to leave power and hand it over." So, so they need a real strategy. And I think the reality is that, what we have learned, from these other lessons is you have to experience a certain amount of failure, from the US side before you decide the strategy isn't working and we'll try something else. And we can sort of debate how long or how sustainable the strategy is, but if you're not getting regime change, you can only keep these ships, which are pretty expensive to maintain, floating offshore in the Caribbean for so long. If you've hyped up the rhetoric, about, these guys are illegitimate, then something's got to give. And if you're getting dribs and drabs of migration relief, but really not the 800,000 that they're looking to return to Venezuela, then at some point, even when you're talking tough, you're going to look like a failure, because nothing is actually happening. And so I think that's why we're going to see what we're going to see for a month or so. I don't think there's going to be an invasion. You can't pacify the country, and it would be very unpopular in MAGA world were you to try. But the bluff strategy will work for a few weeks, and after that, they're going to need a real strategy, and that's where, as Jeff pointed out, they had one in 2020. There's been a lot of suggestions there, but until that happens, then we're not going to see much success. But what we will see is increasing distress and privation inside Venezuela, which will lead to, to sort of humanitarian distress, and it will again lead to outward migration. Maybe not all the way to the U.S. in a month or so, but certainly to the neighbors, and that's not a good way to build multilateral support.
Right. Let me now turn to Francisco, and I'd like for us to drill down now on energy security and really the strategic balance perhaps that the U.S. is trying to seek. I mean, it's obvious that Venezuela still possesses the largest proven oil reserves. We know that production remains far below potential. So, Francisco, I guess it's a twofold question. The first, more broader, how do developments in global geopolitics and the oil market impact U.S. policy toward Venezuela? That would be the first one. And then the second part of the question is how do energy security considerations factor into any kind of sanctions policy design? And how should we understand this balance that, in fact, we've been talking about it, right, between protecting American business interests and at the same time maintaining pressure on the regime?
Sure. I think, the one fact that we have to keep in mind is the interconnection between a lot of the issues of foreign policy these days and the oil market and what might happen or not in regarding to policy in Venezuela. I mean, think about this: the major sort of U.S. international issues, including the issues of trade relations with China, the issue of the war in Ukraine and Iran, are all impacted by, in some way, by sanctions in the oil market, right? On the one hand, the U.S. is, pressuring Russia with further sanctions. Is impacting India recently with that too. Has threatened China, and of course Iran, and so. And the overarching, sort of objective today of President Trump, of course, is reducing oil prices so that inflationary pressures in the U.S. Decline. So much so that he's putting that objective in a way that contradicts his objective of increasing production in the U.S., and it's actually hurting production in the U.S. So depending on what happens in other much higher priorities than Venezuela, that impacts sort of your second question, right? Because if the price of oil goes up, even though Venezuela, I would argue in a second, is not a major player despite having so significant resources, the fact is that the U.S. will feel, pressured to behave differently with Venezuela if the oil prices are going up, or if they are ratcheting up, pressure to Iran and Russia at the same time. Venezuela, of course, being much less of a priority, the approach will be probably very different. However, the opposite is true, of course. And this year, it's important to understand the pressures have been for a decline in the price of oil despite the crisis in Iran. I mean, there is oversupply. OPEC is increasing production. Saudi Arabia is behaving in a way by multiple reasons, including, pleasing President Trump, but I think they have other strategic objectives in a way that is making the pressures in the oil market less significant for an increase in the price of oil. Having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind that Venezuela produces less than 1% of the world oil production, and that in part because of the reasons that Gabriela mentioned before. Venezuela, I mean, it's important, I think, to understand that unless there is not only regime change in Venezuela, but political stability and sort of realignment of Venezuela with the West, in that, relations are stably open, the magnitude of investment that is required to be attracted to Venezuela, to get back to the previous levels of production is in the order of $100 billion. That is not going to happen. And so you require a lot of things to align for any significant increase in oil production in Venezuela. If not, I mean, for example, if you had the Biden licenses in place, you would see an increase of oil production in Venezuela, no doubt, but it will be a modest increase in oil production. In reverse, unless there is a massive pressure, like a blockade of Venezuelan tankers getting out of Venezuela, production will remain stagnant and maybe declining, but not in a very significant way. Not, for example, as what happened in 2020, which was a combination of COVID and other things happening at the same time. So the range of outcomes in the next 2 or 3 years is not going to be that different in different scenarios, except for the very extreme one of regime change or a blockade, right? The other thing, and I think this is very important to understand, is that the record of the Chavismo managing the oil industry is so abysmal. Not only they completely destroy the national oil company, that to a level that is like, there is only ruins there. And that is why they require so much foreign investment. But also the track record in terms of violating every single deal and reneging on absolutely everything. So in Venezuela, there is not any type of rule of law in the oil sector, and I think that's very important to keep in mind. In fact, the recent contracts that were given, and today or yesterday there was this news about China Concord, a company that is a sanctioned company that trades Venezuelan oil and that has committed to do some investment in some small fields in Venezuela. And that might be one of the few of these contracts that recently Venezuela has signed that might, add some production. But this is a company that does not operate oil field. It's a trading company. They are only doing this because the Venezuelan government is pushing them to do that in order to give them cargoes. And outside of that, what we're seeing is just a few investments by local cronies connected to the government in some of in some fields. So it's not going to be anything significant if there is no an important change in policy, both in Venezuela but also in the sanctions regime. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Having said that, the U.S. has, of course, interest in first, getting some heavy oil from Venezuela, is attractive for refiners in the Gulf Coast because they made in the past tons of investments to process heavy oil, and they are not getting it from Mexico. Colombia is declining. Ecuador is not, so there is no heavy oil. The only one that there's plenty in Canada, but it's hard to get it down to the Gulf Coast. Just a fraction gets. So that's one consideration. And I think the other consideration, of course, is if there is a situation in the future, I'm not talking about the short term, but like in the midterm, there is a potential scenario in the world of a shortfall in oil. And Venezuela, in that circumstance, could become a much more relevant actor again, because it's one of the few places in which you could imagine that a major increase in production could happen in a period of 4 or 5 years. But I think in the short run, what happens in Venezuela is of very limited importance in the energy markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've now we've been at it for an hour. We have about 30 more minutes of conversation here. We have a few questions that are coming in through our chat, and so let's go another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll try to answer some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. So, and those of you who
Eduardo, will you take a two-finger on Francisco's points?
Yes, of course.
Great, thanks. No, because I think, and I welcome the questions from the audience as well. Just two things, Francisco, about what you said. I think one that I wanted to highlight. One is this potential for a medium-heavy crude oil squeeze, because right now, if there are tougher sanctions in Iran that impact China, that would materially affect the global market. If there are sanctions, again, on China about sanctioning them or imposing secondary tariffs for importing Russian crude, which the president is not doing right now, that would have a significant impact on the market. And right now, when the market is pretty flush, the administration can afford to reduce the role of those energy security concerns. But it's got, as Francisco points out, 3 balls in the air now. And so you can't squeeze all of those without having a shortfall, which will impact domestic prices. So the conditions are quite favorable right now, but that really could change. The second is what happens inside Venezuela. And long term, if you want to return migrants to Venezuela, and if you don't want people to leave Venezuela, then you have to have electricity, you have to have petrol, you have to have the ability to have transportation, you have to have fertilizer for agriculture. And what we saw before is if, Eni is not allowed to produce gas and you don't have gas to power the power plants, then you don't have fertilizer and you don't have that kind of transportation. And if you put so much pressure on that they are not able to refine enough for the domestic market, then you have massive shortages and ambulances can't move and vehicles. So at some point, these impoverished Venezuela and return migrants policies are at loggerheads with each other. And the only release valve on there is to allow some flexibility to increase domestic production, to allow product to be provided at least for the domestic market. So I think that's what was going on with the Biden era sanctions. It wasn't world shaking for the global market, but it did create conditions in which Venezuelans stopped wanting to leave Venezuela. And so I think that's what the administration is going to have to face. And so these two factors could change the salience of energy security and the need for production in Venezuela in the administration's calculus. And that could happen in months rather than years, depending on what the other policies are.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on this particular issue before we move away from the energy side? Okay, so let me move on very quickly here and perhaps tackle an area that really leads us to think more broadly about what's going on in both in the Caribbean and specifically with Venezuela. And that has to do with, let's say, strategic competition and perhaps looking a little bit more at regional dynamics. I mean, it's clear that China and Russia maintain some kind of economic and security relationships with Venezuela. Um, so, how do these approaches by the U.S., in other words, pressure versus engagement, affect strategic competition with these great powers? And frankly, I think the other question that some of you were really raising is how does this particular approach right now affect long-term American influence in the region? So let me go. First, I'll start with Jeff, and then maybe Chris and Gabriela, if you want to chime in as well. But I'd like to get your opinion on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question, and I think that's one reason why you're seeing the U.S. Start to take the long view on Venezuela, and that's one reason why you've seen the decision to issue the Chevron license, and why you're seeing this sort of private coordination with Venezuela on deportations. I think the reality is that the U.S. is starting to recognize that it's not in its long-term geopolitical interest to simply sit back and fold our arms and watch as Venezuela sort of drifts further into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese. Having said that, I think it's important to put the Chinese and Russian influence into perspective. The contracts that have already been mentioned, these productive participation contracts, are actually pretty limited in scope. So far, the companies like the Chinese one, which was just mentioned, involved in this do not appear to be putting up a ton of money. And of course, there's a ton of risk involved in violating U.S. sanctions. So, the idea that Venezuela is just going to, suddenly start to see a torrential wave of new Chinese and Russian investment, I think can be pretty safely discarded, especially given that Venezuela is still catching up to its debt payments with China, and the Chinese have been pretty clear that they're not interested in dumping a ton of new investments into Venezuela. Having said that, I also think that this new license is actually kind of ironically doesn't actually advance one of the arguments for an oil license. The reality is that, rather than these joint ventures paying royalties and taxes with OFAC oversight, this new license actually sees less oil going to the U.S., and it just creates an extra step for the regime to sell more oil to China on the black market. So, one of the arguments that we heard for maintaining U.S. sanctions licenses in Venezuela was to counter Chinese influence. And in fact, what we've seen is more oil actually going to China. I think one thing also to note here is that the U.S. a few months ago, I think in March, President Trump signed an executive order tasking Secretary Rubio with the sole authority to impose 25% tariffs on countries that import Venezuelan crude. That would be a big deal for China and Malaysia if that was ever implemented. But I think as we've seen, trade negotiations with East Asia are complicated enough without adding Venezuela into the mix. And so, I think what we're seeing here is it's sort of a policy drift. I think yes, more policymakers in Washington are aware of the long-term risks to doing nothing on Venezuela, but Venezuela is a simmering conflict. It's not boiling over like Ukraine or the Middle East. And so, I think with that comes the risk that, making hard decisions carries political costs. And that's one reason why I say that, unfortunately, this equilibrium that we're in, I think, is relatively stable. And I think we could just sort of see the stagnation of U.S. policy towards Venezuela moving forward. And I think that's a real risk that I see.
Great. David, would you like to add something to this? And then anybody else who wants to add as well. But I think
Sure.
that this post some of the things that you've said before, right?
Yeah, just to broaden this out a little bit beyond Venezuela, I mean, the U.S. has been on the losing side, I think, of the competition for influence in the Caribbean more broadly, vis-a-vis China and Russia for some time. And the problem is, and even influence from Venezuela. If you dial back to, to sort of the fuel shortages, and Venezuela had Petrosur and Petrocaribe, and there are still countries in the Caribbean that appreciate that Venezuela helped them when others wouldn't. China is bringing, its debt diplomacy, but they are building roads and they're making significant inroads in a lot of places, not necessarily in oil, but in infrastructure because it serves their interests. And the U.S. has had the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, and we had PAC 2030, which was a lot of talk and not a lot of money. And so, the reality is that right now, China is a big buyer of goods and they're a big investor. And now we've brought the Russians back into Venezuela. So the U.S. has Guyana, I think, because the companies that invest there. But in the rest of the Caribbean, it is kind of up for grabs, and we lose votes in the OAS all the time because essentially the Caribbean is very skeptical about how solid U.S. interest is and whether there's anything behind it. So I think there is absolutely room for improvement. I think the U.S. could, be investing in the Caribbean and sort of dual fuel and providing better energy and getting them off of diesel and, providing resilience. But what we are doing in terms of practice is we're imposing tariffs even on Caribbean countries, and so, what's the message here in terms of competing for influence in the Caribbean? The U.S. wants to put tariffs on some of these countries, and we want to tell them what to do, and we're raising the cost of transactions. And the Chinese are coming with help, and the Russians are coming with arms. So we're not doing as well as we could. We used to be trying, at least under the Biden administration, to try and be helpful in a number of areas. But right now, this administration has yet to have a policy, a proactive policy for competing for influence in the Caribbean more broadly.
Although it is significant that Trinidad has endorsed the U.S. action in the Caribbean, right? So let me, Gabriela, I'll go to Francisco first, and then I'll turn to you. Okay? All right, Francisco.
Yeah, I just wanted to very quickly agree with Jeff in that I think on the energy side, we need to keep in mind that it's not that in the short term, the Chinese, particularly the state-owned enterprises like CNPC, are gonna significantly invest in Venezuela under the current scenarios. Much less the Russians that are having to use their resources for their own issues, and there are competitors of Venezuela in the global markets compared to the Chinese. It's also the case that the oil imported by China is not imported except for a small fraction by the national companies, but by the so-called teapot refineries. And the only reason why they buy it is because of the very heavy discounts they get from the Venezuelan oil. Now they have the competition of Russian oil also discounted. But of course, it is the case that Russia and China and Iran consider Venezuela an important geopolitical ally, being particularly in the region where it is located and having these very significant hydrocarbon resources. So I do think that it's clearly in the interest of the United States to keep, for example, a company like Chevron inside Venezuela and to have something to trade sort of with Maduro in a way that gives them influence over the Venezuelan government. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that it's not, in the energy space, that we're going to see, big investments by China taking over Venezuela or Russia. I think those are highly exaggerated ideas that have been sometimes floated. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriela, you wanted to say something.
Yes, you know that because we are lawyers, after the embassy, the first door that any investor talk is our door. So we do have Chinese investors that are willing to invest billions of dollars in Venezuela, and they have already signed an MOU. So be careful, because they are coming. The thing is not the CNPC guys, you're totally right on that, not the government of China, but China have a great number of billionaires, and some of the ex-CNPC workers are now working for the billionaires, and they're coming with investments. So we have to bear in mind that.
I disagree, but
no, but I saw the contracts, and
Gabriela, but how many contracts have been signed in Venezuela in the last 25 years that had not been executed? I mean, if you add the billions of dollars that in deals that Venezuela has signed, you can come up with figures of $200 billion, and
yes, you're right.
Almost nothing has happened.
You are right, but what I'm saying is, although you are right that the government of China will not invest and CNPC will not invest in Venezuela, and they will not do anything against sanctions, there are other players that we have to bear in mind. And probably they are not under the radar of everybody, but they are under my radar. That's why I share the knowledge with you.
No, I understand.
Great. Thank you, Gabriela. That's a very, very interesting point. And it actually leads me to ask the question to the panel, whoever wants to answer it, that comes from Francisco Sanguino, who says, seen as Russian and Chinese investment in Venezuela is not substantial enough to significantly alter the status quo. What can be said about the role of other geopolitical actors in the country, Turkey, Iran? And he finalizes the question by saying, considering the lackluster state of the Venezuelan oil sector, to what extent has illegal mining played a role here? So who wants to tackle that question?
I can just mention that Iran has had a role in the Venezuelan oil sector in the past in helping, for example, recover the refineries that at some point got to a low level of 100,000 barrels of, Venezuela has a nameplate capacity of more than 1 million barrels, but they were processing about 100,000 barrels in the worst of times. Today, they are processing more than 200,000 barrels, and that was in part because of the technical help by Iran. But Iran is not interested in investing in upstream in oil production in Venezuela. In fact, they were not interested in investing in refining. They just were paid to repair the refineries, and part of that deal with was repaid with crude. By the way, Iran is likely to be in the future, if Chevron cannot bring enough diluents for the rest of the Venezuelan oil industry because of the type of license that they got, it is going to be probably one of the providers of diluents. Remember that Venezuela imports upwards of 100,000 barrels, sometimes as high as 200 of refined products for the domestic market and diluents. And lately, only a tanker from Russia with diluents has arrived to Venezuela, but they had a significant inventory. And so in the next few months, we might see Iran again reestablishing a relationship with Venezuela for diluents. And similarly, it's possible that the Russians continue to send some ships. Right now, because of all this influx situation with the U.S. Navy coming, et cetera, I think everyone is in a wait and see mode exactly of how events progress in the next few weeks. Thanks.
Chris, did you have something to say on this?
Thanks, Eduardo. Briefly, I mean, you there? Yeah. But Francisco will be able to answer this better, but I see many of these as long-term bets. Right now, given the restrictions, the threat, although, as I believe it was David said, secondary tariffs are kind of a, you know, kind of a ruse. I mean, we can't imagine. And in fact, I spoke to a senior member of the sanctions team in the State Department here, who said, you know, look, we don't even know how those things will work. I mean, we haven't figured them into the mix. Trump is doing his own thing with tariffs, but these other things are basically long-term bets, whether it's Rosneft, whether it's Chinese contracts, Gabriella was mentioning, whether it's Iranians, you know, they may not be viable now, but at a certain point, there'll come a time when some of these companies can make a claim on these assets. And that will be a very difficult time for how you unwind their claims and contract sanctity relative to opening up investments to pro-Western companies. So we don't need to see the production now. And this is true also, by the way, when there are secondary sanctions on debt. A lot of the bonds that could not be traded among Western companies were being snapped up by Russians, Qataris, and the Chinese. When it comes time to renegotiate, what is it, the $160 billion worth of debt that Venezuela owes, you're going to have some pretty shady characters around the table there that will have at least a say in that. And it's unclear what that will mean. So I don't think this is necessarily an issue of the moment. I think it's more of a long-term issue, whatever happens to the Venezuelan government.
Okay, great. Well, we're close to wrapping up, and I am particularly interested in your crystal ball, right? I mean, this is a very fluid moment, and it's very interesting to see. In fact, some of the questions that we get asked daily by journalists in trying to explain what's going on. So you've really clarified some of my own thinking on this. So let me ask you each to take 3 minutes each, let us say, to basically speculate a little bit about, you know, what is the path forward? What do we see happening in the next 24 hours, 3 months, 6 months, et cetera, right? Because in fact, in this new context, right, sometimes uncertainty and policy changes occur within the day, not within the week or within the month or within the year. So what do each of you expect in the next in the near future? And let me again start with Gabriela. You get to go first.
I don't see anything happening in the near future. I think we are going to see changes because we cannot continue like this. To give you an example, a university professor is getting less than $1 per month, and a coffee is 1.5, up to $6. So imagine. That is unbearable. We cannot continue like this. So changes must happen, but I don't think that regime change is something that is going to happen very soon. My view, as you say, crystal ball. One thing that I wanted to mention that is not necessarily connected to that is before we go, I wanted to talk about the perception of the Venezuelans that we have abroad. And it is extremely important because although I have been treated with respect in the United States and elsewhere, and I'm very lucky to have that, there is a lot of compatriots that had been unfairly stigmatized, like we were all part of the gangs, of criminal gangs of Tren de Aragua. And Venezuelans, in reality, we are hardworking, we're resilient, we are creative, family-oriented, and determined to rebuild our lives. So it's important that we deserve respect and support, especially from those countries that we helped so much when we were a very prosperous nation. So I didn't want to finish my speech without asking for the help of everybody and thanking you for giving me the platform to talk about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Great. Let's go to David next. What is your crystal ball, David? Where are we going?
Well, short term, I'm watching to see what they do with these ships, and particularly whether they are going to harass any of the tankers which are leaving Venezuela for China. My guess is they won't. It'd be sort of boarding those ships would be a violation of international law. They could purportedly say they're going to search them for drugs or something like that. But then these are not Venezuelan ships. They are, they're Chinese and other tankers. So that would be quite a provocative step. So if that happens, then there'll be a reaction to that. But so that's what I'm kind of watching short term. Medium term, I think the questions are how does Venezuela react? Is there external migration pressure? Do Venezuelans start to leave as conditions become worse? Does the regime react in a way which is more provocative with respect to Maria Corina Machado and the opposition? Or do they play, do they play a nice game and continue to release people and have talks and try and play nice with the administration? And then how does the global economy react? Are we dealing with inflation, where energy becomes more important, or are we having the status quo? My bet is that by December, we've had no progress on migration. We've had no progress on regime change. You have a lot of infighting in the Venezuelan opposition from different factions about what the right path forward is. Trump gets tired of not having those 800,000 Venezuelans go back to Venezuela. Rubio has had his day. It's time to move on for something else. And they bring Grenell back, and we're back to negotiations and coexistence, and we don't interfere in other countries. And maybe they declare victory on the drug front, in some way. But I think this is really just a short-term strategy, which I think will shift probably by December or January.
Thank you, David. Let me ask Francisco to go next.
Sure. Well, first, I wanted to agree with Gabriela in that one of the most unfortunate elements of the policies that have been implemented in the last few months has been the impact to the Venezuelans abroad in terms of the stigmatization and all the unjust perception as a country of criminals. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I think I don't see, like others seem to see, a coherency in U.S. policy towards Venezuela. I see, two tracks, one clearly led by Secretary Rubio and others more pragmatist or that want to benefit U.S. companies, the America First. But in neither of those two groups, I see a strategy for helping Venezuela go back to be a democracy, or focus on the human rights issues, or even for focusing on the economic situation of Venezuela. I see factions that are mostly defining their policies because of domestic considerations in the U.S., South Florida politics, business interest in the U.S., and I can understand, that that's how the world works. But I'm pretty, pessimistic, and I completely, of course, agree that what happens inside Venezuela is more important than whatever policies will be made abroad. But without a doubt, the international community has to play a very important role in bringing democracy back to Venezuela, because at this point, what we have in Venezuela is a completely, dictatorial regime that has completely eliminated all the political rights of Venezuelans. So it will be, very hard to achieve without the help of the international community, and in particular of the U.S. So I hope at some point we get some coherent policy that does put somewhere in the priority list bringing democracy back to Venezuela.
Thank you. Jeff, let me go to you and we'll end with Chris. Jeff, you mentioned something to the effect that there had been flights of deportees, that there is an agreement that allows, in fact, deportees to be returned to Venezuela. Maybe in your comments you can address that as well. What does this, in a final analysis, David also mentioned it, right? I mean, Are we going to see an acceleration of deportations in the current context? What do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, I think President Trump has been pretty clear that that's at the top of his priority list, and I think that's one reason why you're continuing to see an acceleration of deportation flights to Venezuela. As I mentioned, there were 9 deportation flights to Venezuela last month. All but 3 of those were charter flights paid for by the U.S. government that took off from ICE detention facilities and landed in Maiquetía. I think we've seen more and more of those flights occur, and I think it's a signal that beneath the surface, there's still some interest in a back channel with Caracas. I also think that, to Gabriela's point, it really underscores the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. I mean, in Trump 1, we saw the president in 2018 work with partners in the region to start the Quito process to incentivize countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and others to accept expired travel documents as valid, to provide a pathway to normalize migration status for fleeing Venezuelans. You know, I would hope that Secretary Rubio, given his past work on Venezuela, given how much attention he pays to this, might be able to pick up the pieces of the Quito process and potentially revisit some of that as we continue these conversations on migration management around the region. As far as the crystal ball goes, I just would encourage people to look back 5 years ago and see what happened in 2020. We started that year with President Trump receiving Juan Guaido in his State of the Union address in Washington. We saw one faction of the opposition invoke the TIAR, the Inter-American Reciprocal Defense Treaty, essentially being critical of the Guaido faction for not leaning into the prospect of military intervention hard enough. You saw at least 3 freedom of navigation operations from U.S. naval assets in the Caribbean, and you saw very high hopes for a military intervention in Venezuela. And how did the year end? It ended with President Trump giving an interview saying that he regretted supporting the interim government of Venezuela, and claiming that he would be open to meeting with Maduro. Of course, there was a change in administration, but the next administration saw all of this, and they shifted policy and they moved towards a sticks and carrots approach. And I think that's ultimately where we're going to end up. I think getting to Francisco's point on the 2 tracks, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think you could envision a good cop, bad cop routine here. But in order for that to work, you need to know that the cops are talking and that when they both go into the back room, there's some kind of a plan moving forward. And I think that's the missing piece.
Thank you, Jeff. And we may get kicked off, Chris.
I'll be very quick.
Humanitarian forces
Thank
behind
you for the invitation, everyone. I'm just going to say a few things. First of all, I want to echo Gabriela's comments. I mean, the tragedy of this isn't U.S. policy's failures. It is the image, the treatment of Venezuelans wedged between a repressive, brutal, cruel government and a U.S. government that is willing to malign all Venezuelans, or at least indirectly, in its broader policy of anti-immigration and deportations, but also now trying to justify, whether it's claiming they're all part of Tren de Agua or Carteles de los Soles. We don't know, Cartel de los Soles, we don't know what other way they'll try to malign them. It's heartbreaking, it really is. I can't imagine, I can't conjure up any sort of analogous situation in U.S. history such as this. You know, even during the Reagan policies towards Central America, there was always a faith in human beings, and even El Salvadorans and others that were fleeing violence. So I'll say just, so first of all, I don't know where this, David mentioned this, I don't know where this naval mission goes. At a certain point, if it doesn't deliver the goods of a breakdown in defections or whatever, at a certain point, it has to be brought back for financial reasons, for even just the shame of having it parked there off the coast of Venezuela. It's not going to block Russian and Chinese tankers. It may shoot down a few overflights, maybe a few of those really sort of jerry-rigged submarines that leave Venezuela and make their way across, for some reason I don't know, across the Atlantic. But at a certain point, they're going to have, and then here's the issue, is I don't have a crystal ball for this, because the truth is Trump hates to lose. In fact, he lied about an election in 2020 that he lost. what will he do if he has to call back the troops? Is he just going to ignore it, like that he could claim he could solve the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 24 hours, or will he do something drastic? And that's really the risk. There is really very much an unpredictability factor here with Trump that could be very, very dangerous. I think the opposition will engage in infighting. It's been said. I think the fact that it is doubled down and sort of, well, at least its leadership and embracing this. But I don't think this policy in the Trump administration is sustainable. I often wish that if you could average Marco Rubio's position with Rick Grinnell's position, you'd actually get a sensible position. Engage, including diplomatically, in the honor and name of human rights. But that's not going to happen. You've got two completely competing narratives right now and approaches. I don't know where it goes. I'm sorry, Eduardo, I'm failing you entirely on my crystal ball, but it looks more than a little clouded right now.
Right. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this panel. I learned a lot. I always do from you all. I want to thank Gabriela in Caracas, Francisco at Rice, Jeff in Bogota, David in Lake Placid. Did I get that correct? And Chris in London from sunny Miami. Thank you all, and I look forward to another panel like these.
Thank you,
for having
Eduardo.
us.
Thank you very much. This is
Bye.
great.
So much, Eduardo.
I learned a lot too.
Bye-bye.